January 17, 1945. Hürtgen Forest, Western Germany. The snow fell like ash over the blackened trees. A young grenadier named Klaus Becker crouched in a foxhole, barely 3 feet deep, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. His hands, wrapped in strips of burlap, trembled not from cold alone, but from the weight of what he had seen. Across the cratered field, where the pines had been sheared to splinters by artillery, he watched the American line. They moved with an ease that seemed impossible, dozens of them, advancing not in the desperate rushes he had learned in training, but in coordinated waves, their rifles snapping with mechanical precision. Every fifth man carried the same weapon, a small, stubby carbine that looked almost toy-like against the bulk of their winter coats. Klaus had been told the Americans were soft, that their equipment was mass-produced junk, that their soldiers were shopkeepers playing at war. But the sound of that little rifle, sharp, relentless, unanswered, told a different story. It was the sound of something his commanders had not prepared him for. It was the sound of abundance. The M1 Carbine was never supposed to be a symbol of anything. When the United States Army issued a specification in 1940 for a lightweight weapon to arm officers, truck drivers, radio men, and support troops, they were solving a mundane logistics problem. The standard M1 Garand rifle weighed nearly 10 pounds and was too cumbersome for soldiers whose primary job was not frontline combat. The .45 caliber pistol lacked range and stopping power. What the Army wanted was something in between, a weapon light enough to carry all day, powerful enough to matter in a firefight, and cheap enough to produce by the millions. Winchester Repeating Arms Company answered the call with a design so simple it seemed almost naive. The carbine weighed just over 5 pounds. It fired a .30 caliber intermediate cartridge that was less powerful than a rifle round, but far more effective than a pistol. It cost $16 per unit to manufacture. $16. By the standards of military procurement, it was disposable. By the end of the war, America would produce more than 6 million of them. In the spring of 1942, when the first M1 carbines reached training camps across the United States, they were met with skepticism. Career infantry officers dismissed them as underpowered. Veteran shooters complained about their limited range. Compared to the heavy 8-pound Garand with its powerful .30-06 cartridge, the carbine seemed like a concession, a weapon for men who would never see real combat. But wars are not won by the weapons soldiers admire. They are won by the weapons soldiers can actually use. And the M1 Carbine, with its lightweight frame, 15-round magazine, and semi-automatic fire, was a weapon that nearly anyone could use effectively. It required less training than a Garand. It was easier to carry through jungles, deserts, and mountains. It allowed a support soldier pinned down by enemy fire to return accurate, suppressive fire without the burden of a full battle rifle. It was not a weapon designed to win individual duels. It was a weapon designed to be everywhere at once. The German army did not understand this at first. Their doctrine was built on precision and firepower concentrated in the hands of elite infantry. The standard German rifle, the Karabiner 98K, was a bolt-action weapon descended from designs of the previous century. It was accurate, reliable, and deadly in the hands of a trained marksman. But it was also slow. A skilled rifleman could fire perhaps 15 aimed shots per minute. The M1 Carbine, in the hands of even a moderately trained soldier, could fire 30. And that difference, those extra 15 rounds per minute multiplied across hundreds of thousands of soldiers, created a kind of pressure that German commanders had not anticipated. In North Africa, in Italy, in France, German soldiers began to report something strange. They were not being outfought by superior tactics or better soldiers. They were being overwhelmed by sheer volume. Every American squad seemed to have more automatic and semi-automatic weapons than doctrine suggested was possible. The line between frontline infantry and support troops had blurred. The man fixing a radio, the officer coordinating artillery, the driver of a supply truck, they all carried weapons that could engage effectively at 200 yards. The battlefield had become saturated with firepower. By the winter of 1944, when the Wehrmacht launched its final great offensive in the Ardennes, German soldiers were already familiar with the carbine. They had seen it in the hands of paratroopers, tank crews and engineers. Some had captured them and used them themselves, preferring the lightweight American weapon to their own cumbersome rifles. But familiarity did not breed contempt, it bred a kind of exhausted respect. In the frozen hills around Bastogne, surrounded American forces held their ground not because they had better positions or more men, but because every defender could lay down sustained fire. The M1 Carbine became the weapon of last resort for medics, for cooks, for clerks pressed into the line. It was the weapon that allowed men who were not soldiers by training to fight like soldiers by necessity. And it worked. The German offensive collapsed not in a single dramatic battle, but in 1,000 small firefights where volume of fire mattered more than marksmanship. There was a moment, documented in a letter home by a captured Oberleutnant named Friedrich Hahn, when the symbolic weight of the carbine became clear. Hahn had been taken prisoner in January 1945 near the German border. He was processed at a field camp and then transferred to a rear area holding facility. What struck him was not the size of the American force or the sophistication of their equipment. It was the casual abundance. The guards who watched over him carried carbines. The truck drivers who transported him carried carbines. The cooks who served his meals had carbines stacked against the tent poles. He wrote, "They have given their clerks and chauffeurs a weapon better than what we issue our best infantry. This is not a matter of tactics, it is a matter of philosophy. They do not ask whether a man deserves a good weapon, they simply assume he should have one." Hahn's observation was more profound than he realized. The M1 Carbine was not a superior weapon in the technical sense. It did not outrange or outshoot the German carabiner, but it represented a different conception of warfare, one in which firepower was not rationed, but distributed, in which every man in the chain of supply was also a potential link in the chain of combat. The Japanese Empire faced a similar reckoning in the Pacific. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized marksmanship, discipline, and the spiritual superiority of the warrior. The standard Arisaka Type 38 rifle was a bolt-action weapon of exceptional quality, effective at long range and deadly in the hands of trained soldiers. But Japanese supply lines were fragile, and their industrial base could not match American production. By 1943, as American forces began their island-hopping campaign, Japanese defenders found themselves facing an enemy who seemed to violate every assumption about resource scarcity. On Guadalcanal, on Tarawa, on Saipan, Japanese soldiers who had been taught to conserve ammunition and choose their shots carefully encountered American forces who fired in such volume that the jungle itself seemed to echo with gunfire. The M1 Carbine was everywhere. Marine Corps raiders carried them through the dense undergrowth. Army engineers clearing roads carried them. Even some civilian contractors attached to the military carried them. The weapon's light weight made it ideal for the humid, close-quarters combat of the Pacific, and its semi-automatic action meant that a single American soldier, surprised by a Japanese patrol, could respond with overwhelming firepower. There are accounts, fragmentary and scattered through after-action reports, of Japanese officers trying to make sense of this abundance. One captured diary, translated after the Battle of Peleliu, contained a passage that read, "The Americans waste bullets as if they have no end. Every man fires as if he is alone responsible for victory. We are taught to aim and to husband our strength. They are taught to shoot and to trust in their supply. We cannot win a war of waste." The writer was correct in his assessment but wrong in his conclusion. It was not waste. It was a different kind of economy. The United States had built a war machine that could afford to give millions of soldiers a weapon that was good enough, rather than a few thousand soldiers a weapon that was perfect. The carbine was not the best rifle ever made, but it was the most available. And availability in war is its own kind of superiority. By the time the war ended in August 1945, the M1 Carbine had become the second most produced American small arm of the conflict, exceeded only by the M1 Garand. More than 6 million had been manufactured by a coalition of companies that included Winchester, Inland Division of General Motors, IBM, and even a jukebox manufacturer. The weapon had been issued to every branch of service, to every theatre of war, and to allies ranging from the Free French to the Chinese nationalists. It had been used in roles its designers never imagined, by partisans in the mountains of Yugoslavia, by resistance fighters in the Philippines, by Korean laborers who took up arms against their Japanese occupiers. The carbine had transcended its original purpose. It had become a tool of liberation, not because it was particularly powerful, but because it was particularly available. In the years after the war, military analysts would debate the carbine's effectiveness. Critics pointed to its limited range and stopping power. There were documented cases of the .30 carbine round failing to penetrate heavy winter clothing or to reliably incapacitate enemy soldiers. Some veterans swore by it, others swore at it, but the debates missed the larger point. The M1 Carbine was never designed to be the ultimate weapon. It was designed to be an adequate weapon in the hands of as many people as possible. And in that role, it succeeded beyond any measure. It armed the men who built the bridges, who drove the trucks, who strung the communication lines. It gave them a fighting chance when the front lines collapsed or when the rear areas came under attack. It allowed the United States to field an army in which every man, regardless of his official role, was a potential combatant. That was its genius, not in its engineering, but in its philosophy. The carbine would outlive the war by decades. It saw service in Korea, where its lightweight and rapid fire made it ideal for the close-quarters combat of urban warfare and mountain ambushes. It was used by French forces in Indochina, by Israeli soldiers in the Wars of Independence, by American advisors in Vietnam. Surplus carbines were sold, gifted, and smuggled to insurgent groups and nationalist movements around the world. In places where military budgets were measured in thousands rather than millions, the carbine became a weapon of choice precisely because it was so common. Parts were easy to find. Ammunition was available. Soldiers who had never seen advanced training could learn to use it in an afternoon. The $16 rifle had become a global phenomenon, not because it was treasured, but because it was accessible. There is a photograph, taken in May 1945, that captures something of this spirit. It shows an American soldier, a corporal from a supply unit, sitting on the hood of a jeep somewhere in southern Germany. His carbine rests across his knees. He is not posing. He is not celebrating. He is simply waiting for orders, waiting to go home, waiting for the future to arrive. The carbine in his hands is scratched and worn. The finish has rubbed off in places. The stock is dinged and scarred. It is not a beautiful weapon, but it is his weapon. It has kept him alive, and in that moment, captured by an anonymous photographer, it represents something larger than itself. It represents the idea that a democracy at war does not hoard its strength. It distributes it. It trusts its citizens with tools and expects them to rise to the occasion. Klaus Becker survived the war. He was captured in March 1945 and spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp in France before returning to Germany. In an interview given decades later, he was asked what he remembered most about fighting the Americans. He did not talk about their tanks or their artillery or their air superiority. He talked about the sound, the constant overlapping sound of semi-automatic fire. It was not like fighting an army, he said. It was like fighting a factory. They had so many guns and every gun was firing, we could not keep up. We were not beaten by better soldiers. We were beaten by more soldiers with enough weapon to matter. He paused and then added, "That little rifle. I think about it still. We made better guns, but they made more, and in the end, more was better." The M1 Carbine was never the weapon America bragged about. It was not the Garand celebrated in propaganda films as the greatest battle implement ever devised. It was not the Thompson submachine gun immortalized in newsreels and war movies. It was the quiet workhorse, the weapon that filled the gaps and armed the margins. But in filling those gaps, it revealed a deeper truth about the conflict. World War II was not won by individual acts of heroism or by superior tactics. It was won by systems, by production lines that never stopped, by supply chains that stretched across oceans, by an economy that could afford to give millions of men a weapon that was good enough and trust that good enough in sufficient quantity would be more than enough. The $16 gun was never taken seriously by the men who designed doctrines or wrote field manuals, but it outlived empires, it outlived ideologies, and it remains even now a quiet reminder that in war, as in all things, abundance is its own form of power.